The train lurched forward with a metallic groan that seemed to echo the uncertainty in Eleanor Walsh's chest. She pressed her gloved hand against the cool window glass, watching the familiar spires of Boston fade into the gray autumn mist. Everything she had ever known was disappearing behind her, and ahead lay only the vast unknown expanse of Montana territory and a man she had never met. Eleanor was 26 years old, which by Boston standards made her practically a spinster. Her reflection in the train window showed a woman with honest green eyes, auburn hair pinned sensibly beneath a modest hat, and a face that her late mother had called handsome rather than beautiful. She had worked for 3 years as a schoolteacher in a cramped one-room building where the children of factory workers came with empty stomachs and emptier futures. When the school had closed due to lack of funding, Eleanor had found herself with few options and even fewer prospects. The advertisement had appeared in the Boston Herald on a Tuesday morning in September. Hard-working farmer in Montana territory seeks respectable woman for marriage. Must be of good character and strong constitution. Life will be simple, but honest. Write to James Thornton, care of Silver Creek Post Office. The words were plain and unadorned, much like Eleanor imagined the man himself to be. She had responded that very evening, her pen scratching across the paper by candlelight, as she crafted a letter that was truthful but not desperate, hopeful but not naive. James Thornton's reply had arrived 3 weeks later. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant for a farmer, though the paper was cheap and thin. He wrote of his small farm in the valley near Silver Creek, of the hard winters and the satisfaction of working the land, of his need for a wife to help build a life together. He mentioned that he was 32 years old, had come west 5 years ago, and lived alone in a simple cabin. He made no promises of luxury or ease, only honesty and hard work. Eleanor had appreciated his frankness. She had seen enough of the world to know that grand promises usually concealed greater disappointments. Now, as the train carried her across the endless prairie, Eleanor wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The other passengers in her car included 2 miners heading back to the territories, a salesman with a carpet bag full of patent medicines, and a young mother with 3 small children who looked as worn and worried as Eleanor felt. The journey had already taken 4 days, and according to the conductor, she still had 2 more days of travel ahead of her. She pulled James's letters from her carpet bag and read them again, searching for clues about the man she was traveling so far to marry. There were 5 letters in total, each one revealing a bit more about him. He wrote about the beauty of the mountains at sunset, about his 2 horses named Buck and Sally, about the challenges of farming in a climate so different from back east. He asked thoughtful questions about her teaching, about her family, about her hopes for the future. But there was something he never quite revealed, a sense that he was holding something back. Eleanor told herself she was imagining things, that her nervousness was creating mysteries where none existed. The landscape outside her window had transformed from the rolling hills of the east to the flat, endless expanse of the plains. The sky seemed impossibly large, stretching from horizon to horizon without the interruption of buildings or church steeples. Eleanor had never seen so much open space. It was both thrilling and terrifying. On the 6th day of travel, the train finally pulled into the station at Silver Creek. Eleanor gathered her 2 battered suitcases and a small trunk containing everything she owned in the world. Her legs were unsteady as she stepped onto the wooden platform, her travel-worn dress dusty and wrinkled. The town of Silver Creek consisted of a single muddy street lined with wooden buildings. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church, and perhaps a dozen houses comprised the entire settlement. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Eleanor stood on the platform, searching the handful of people for a man who matched James's description. Tall, he had written, with dark hair and a beard. Strong from years of farm work. She saw 2 cowboys lounging against the station wall, an elderly man collecting a package and a woman in a fine dress stepping into a waiting carriage. But no one approached her. Just as panic began to flutter in her chest, she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Walsh?" Eleanor turned to find a man who took her breath away. He was indeed tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean, powerful build. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and his beard was well-groomed rather than scraggly. But it was his eyes that struck her most, a deep blue that seemed to hold both warmth and secrets. He wore simple farmer's clothes, work pants, and a cotton shirt under a worn leather vest, but somehow he carried himself with an unexpected grace. "Mr. Thornton?" Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended. "James, please." He removed his hat and held it awkwardly in his hands. "I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." "It was long, but I managed." Eleanor found herself unable to look away from his face. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way that her Boston suitors had never been. There was something in his expression, though, a kind of nervous tension that matched her own anxiety. James picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing and gestured toward a simple wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "I know you must be tired. It's about an hour's ride to the farm. We can talk along the way, get to know each other a bit before the wedding tomorrow, if you're still willing." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. Tomorrow. She would be married tomorrow to this stranger, in this strange land, beginning a life she could barely imagine. She climbed onto the wagon seat, arranging her skirts with trembling hands. James settled beside her and clicked to the horses. As they left the town behind, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that James was watching her from the corner of his eye, measuring her reaction to something she couldn't yet see. The road wound through stands of pine trees and across a wooden bridge that spanned a rushing creek. The air smelled of pine and approaching winter. "Your letters mentioned a cabin," Eleanor said, breaking the awkward silence. "How much land do you farm?" James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Enough to make a living," he said carefully. "Eleanor, there's something I need to tell you about the farm, about what I do here. I wasn't entirely forthcoming in my letters, and I apologize for that. I had my reasons, but you deserve to know the truth before you make your final decision about marrying me." Eleanor's stomach dropped. Here it was, the secret she had sensed in his letters. She gripped the edge of the wagon seat, preparing herself for whatever revelation was coming. Was he in debt? Did he have a criminal past? Was there another woman? But before James could continue, the wagon crested a hill, and Eleanor gasped at what lay before her. Instead of a simple cabin and a few acres of farmland, she saw a vast valley stretching out below them. Hundreds of cattle grazed on the rolling grassland. Several large barns stood near a creek, and in the center of it all, instead of the rough cabin she had expected, sat a substantial 2-story house with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the afternoon sun. Eleanor turned to stare at James, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. "I don't understand. You said you were a farmer. You said you had a simple cabin." James pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of guilt and apprehension. "I am a farmer, in a sense. A cattle rancher, to be more accurate. And I did have a simple cabin when I first came here 5 years ago. But things have changed considerably since then." He took a deep breath. "Eleanor, I own everything you see before you. 12,000 acres, 800 head of cattle, and 5 men who work for me. I'm not a poor farmer scratching out a living. I'm one of the wealthiest ranchers in Montana Territory." Eleanor couldn't find words. Her hands had gone numb despite her gloves, and she felt as if the world had tilted sideways. She had prepared herself for hardship and poverty, for a life of back-breaking work and simple meals. She had steeled herself to be strong, to be a partner in survival. But this was something entirely different, and somehow more frightening than poverty could ever have been. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Why would you lie about something like that?" James's face darkened with emotion. He set the wagon brake and turned to face her fully. "Because I've been lied to before. 3 years ago, I tried to find a wife through an agency in Chicago. I was honest about my circumstances, about the ranch and what I'd built here. The woman who came seemed perfect at first. Beautiful, educated, charming. She said all the right things about wanting a simple life in the West, about valuing hard work and partnership. He paused, his jaw working as if the memory still caused him pain. But it was all an act. She had no interest in me or in building a life together. She wanted the money, the status, the ability to play the grand lady of the manor. She treated my ranch hands like servants, spent money frivolously on expensive items from back east, and made it clear that she found Montana and everything about it beneath her dignity. 3 months after the wedding, she left with a traveling gambler, taking $10,000 worth of jewelry and cash with her. Eleanor listened in stunned silence as James continued. After that, I swore I'd never let money cloud a woman's judgment again. I wanted a wife who would choose me for who I am, not for what I have. Someone who was prepared to work hard and build a life together, who valued honesty and partnership over luxury. So when I wrote those advertisements, I described myself as I was when I first came here, as the man I still am in my heart, even if my circumstances have changed. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Eleanor looked again at the ranch spread out below them, trying to reconcile it with the humble farmer she had imagined for the past 6 weeks. The house was not ostentatious, but it was substantial and well built. The barns were in excellent repair. Everything spoke of prosperity and careful management. "You must think me very foolish," James said quietly. "Or perhaps dishonest. Both would be fair assessments. I told myself I was protecting myself, but I was also deceiving you. If you want to get back on that train tomorrow and return to Boston, I'll pay for your ticket and give you money to restart your life. You don't owe me anything." Eleanor's mind was racing. She thought about her letters to James, about how carefully she had described her modest circumstances, her simple life, her willingness to work hard. She had been honest in every particular. And yet, hadn't she also been selective in what she revealed? Hadn't she emphasized her practical skills while downplaying her love of poetry and music? Hadn't she presented herself as someone who could thrive in hardship while hiding her secret dreams of beauty and comfort? "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that we have both been more honest and more deceptive than we realized. You deceived me about your wealth, but you were honest about your character and values. I was honest about my circumstances, but I'm not sure I was entirely truthful about my motivations." James's blue eyes fixed on her with intensity. "What do you mean?" Eleanor took a deep breath, deciding that if there was to be honesty between them, it should start now. "I told myself I was coming west for a partnership, for honest work, and a simple life. And that's true, in part. But I was also running away from a life that felt small and limited and prescribed. I wanted adventure. I wanted possibility. I wanted a life that was more than teaching in a cramped schoolroom and growing old in my sister's spare bedroom. So perhaps I'm not so different from your first wife after all." "You are entirely different," James said with unexpected vehemence. "She wanted luxury without work, status without earning it, wealth without understanding its value or responsibility. You're telling me you wanted opportunity and possibility. There's no shame in that. That's why I came west in the first place." The horses shifted restlessly in their harness, and somewhere in the valley below, a dog barked. Eleanor studied James's face, seeing past the physical handsomeness to something deeper. She saw intelligence in his eyes, determination in the set of his jaw, and something else, something vulnerable and uncertain that made him suddenly very human. "Tell me the whole truth," Eleanor said. "Everything. If we're to be married tomorrow, I need to know exactly what I'm stepping into." James nodded and snapped the reins, guiding the horses down the hill toward the ranch. As they descended, he talked, his voice steady and his words carefully chosen. He told her about coming west 5 years ago with almost nothing, about working as a ranch hand for a cattle baron named Harrison, about saving every penny. When Harrison had decided to return east due to his wife's illness, he had offered to sell James a portion of his land and cattle at a fair price. James had borrowed from the bank, taken an enormous risk, and built on what Harrison had started. "The first 2 years were brutal," James said as they crossed the valley floor. "I worked 18-hour days. I slept in that cabin you expected to find. I ate beans and salt pork for months on end. But the cattle thrived, and I was able to pay back the bank loan. Then I bought more land, hired good men, and built the house. It's been 3 years since I've had to worry about money, but I still work as hard as I did in the beginning. This ranch is everything to me. It's proof that a man can make something of himself through honest work." They were approaching the house now, and Eleanor could see more details. The porch wrapped around the front and side of the building. There were curtains in the windows and flowers planted in beds along the front, though they had been cut back for the winter. A woman's touch, Eleanor thought, and wondered who had done the planting. As if reading her mind, James said, "Mrs. Chen, my housekeeper, planted those flowers. She's Chinese, came here with her husband who worked on the railroad. After he died in an accident, I hired her to keep the house and cook. She's a good woman, practical and hardworking. You'll like her." The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and the door opened immediately. A small, sturdy woman in her 50s emerged, her black hair streaked with grey and pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple dress and an apron, and her dark eyes were sharp and assessing as she looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Walsh," James said, climbing down from the wagon and then reaching up to help Eleanor down. His hands were strong and steady on her waist. "Eleanor, this is Mrs. Chen. She keeps this ranch running more efficiently than I ever could." Mrs. Chen bowed slightly. "Welcome, Miss Walsh. I have prepared the guest room for you and made dinner. You must be very tired from your journey." Eleanor found herself liking the older woman immediately. There was no judgment in her face, only a practical kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I am tired, and dinner sounds wonderful." James carried Eleanor's trunk inside, and she followed him into a spacious entry hall. The house was simply but solidly furnished. There were no grand chandeliers or gilt mirrors, but everything was of good quality and well maintained. The wooden floors gleamed with polish, and the air smelled of beeswax and something savory cooking in the kitchen. Mrs. Chen led Eleanor upstairs to a comfortable bedroom with a large window overlooking the valley. A fire had been lit in the small fireplace, and there was a pitcher of warm water on the washstand. Eleanor's trunk sat at the foot of the bed, and her smaller bags had been placed on a chair. "I will call you when dinner is ready," Mrs. Chen said. "Mr. James thought you might want time to rest and refresh yourself first." When the door closed behind Mrs. Chen, Eleanor sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day. She had expected to arrive at a rough cabin and immediately begin adjusting to a life of hardship. Instead, she found herself in a comfortable home on a prosperous ranch, engaged to marry a man who was apparently wealthy but had deliberately hidden that fact from her. She should have been angry at the deception, but instead she found herself oddly moved by James's reasoning. He had been hurt and betrayed, and he had protected himself in the only way he knew how. He wanted to be loved for himself, not for his money. Wasn't that something Eleanor could understand? How many times in Boston had she wondered if a man was interested in her as a person, or merely as a potential teacher for his children or a caretaker for his household? Eleanor washed her face and hands in the warm water and changed into her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes. It was the dress she had planned to wear for the wedding ceremony. Looking at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she tried to imagine herself as the mistress of this house, as James Thornton's wife. The woman looking back at her seemed both familiar and strange, caught between two lives and two identities. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Dinner is ready, Miss Walsh," Mrs. Chen called. Eleanor descended the stairs to find James waiting in the hallway. He had changed his shirt and combed his hair, and he looked nervous in a way that was oddly endearing. "I thought we could eat in the dining room tonight," he said. "Something of a formal occasion, given the circumstances." The dining room was a pleasant space with a long wooden table and chairs for 8. Only 2 places had been set, at adjacent corners, so they could talk easily. Mrs. Chen had prepared roast chicken with vegetables and potatoes, along with fresh bread, that made Eleanor's mouth water. After days of train food, the meal seemed like a feast. They ate in companionable silence at first, both of them too hungry and too nervous for extended conversation. But as the edge came off their appetites, James began to talk about the ranch, about his daily routines and responsibilities. He explained the cattle business, the seasonal patterns of ranching, the challenges of the harsh Montana winters. "I want you to understand what life here would really be like," James said. "Yes, we have this house and financial security, but it's still a working ranch. I'm up before dawn every day. I spend most of my time outdoors in all kinds of weather. During calving season in the spring and roundup in the fall, I might be gone for days at a time camping out with my men. It's not the life of a wealthy gentleman farmer who oversees everything from an office." Eleanor set down her fork and met his eyes. "And what would you expect of me? What role would I play here?" James seemed to consider the question carefully. "That would be up to you to a large extent. Mrs. Chen manages the household efficiently, so you wouldn't be overwhelmed with domestic duties unless you wanted to take them on. Some ranchers' wives involve themselves in the business, keeping books and managing supplies. Others focus on making a home and raising children. I suppose I'm asking what you want your life here to look like." It was a question Eleanor hadn't expected. In Boston, women's roles were clearly defined and rigidly enforced. Teachers taught, wives kept house, mothers raised children. But James was offering her something different, a chance to define her own purpose and contribution. "I don't know yet," Eleanor admitted. "I've spent the last 6 weeks imagining a life of hardship and constant work. I pictured myself hauling water and churning butter and mending clothes by candlelight. I prepared myself to be strong enough for that life. Now you're telling me I can choose my own path. And I find that almost more daunting than poverty would have been." James leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Can I ask you something honest? Now that you know the truth about my circumstances, does it change how you feel about marrying me? Does the money make it easier or harder?" Eleanor thought about the question seriously. "I think it makes it more complicated. When I thought you were poor, the decision felt simpler. We would work together or fail together. There was a kind of equality in shared hardship. Now there's an imbalance. You have all the power, all the resources. I'm coming here with nothing but 2 suitcases and a trunk. What kind of partnership is that?" "The kind where both people bring different things to the marriage," James said quietly. "You're educated, intelligent, and brave enough to travel across the country to start a new life. Those aren't small things, Eleanor. And if it makes you feel better, I can have my lawyer draw up papers ensuring you'd have financial security regardless of what happens in our marriage. A trust in your name, property rights, whatever would make you feel safe." Eleanor was surprised by the offer. "That's very generous and unusual. Most men would never consider such a thing." "I'm not most men," James said with a slight smile. "And I learned from my first marriage that money can corrupt relationships in both directions. If we're going to build something real together, it has to be based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, not on you being dependent on my goodwill or me worrying that you're only here for financial security." They talked long into the evening, the conversation flowing more easily as they grew comfortable with each other. James told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about his parents who had died in a fire when he was 19, about his decision to head west and make a new start. Eleanor told him about teaching, about her love of books and learning, about her mother's death and her strained relationship with her elder sister, who considered Eleanor's unmarried state a family embarrassment. Finally, as the clock struck 10, James stood. "You must be exhausted. I'll let you get some rest. Tomorrow morning, if you're still willing, we can ride into town and speak with Reverend Matthews about the wedding. Or we can delay it if you need more time to decide. There's no pressure, Eleanor. I want you to be sure." Eleanor stood as well, her legs stiff from sitting so long. "I'll be ready tomorrow morning. I didn't come all this way to turn back now." James's face lit up with a smile that transformed his features from handsome to beautiful. Then I'll say good night, and I'll see you at breakfast. Mrs. Chen is an early riser, so don't be alarmed if you hear her moving about at dawn. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, her mind spinning with everything that had happened in the past few hours. She had left Boston that morning as one person and arrived in Montana as someone entirely different. The future that had seemed so clear in her imagination had been replaced by something far more complex and uncertain. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the mirror again. This time, the woman looking back at her seemed less frightened and more intrigued. Yes, James had deceived her about his wealth, but he had been honest about everything else that mattered. He was hard-working, thoughtful, and willing to treat her as a genuine partner rather than as property. These were rare qualities in a man, wealthy or poor. Eleanor blew out the lamp and climbed into the comfortable bed, pulling the thick quilts up to her chin. Outside her window, she could see stars scattered across the vast Montana sky, more stars than she had ever seen in the lamplit streets of Boston. Tomorrow she would marry James Thornton and begin a new life. It wouldn't be the life she had imagined, but perhaps it would be something better. Perhaps it would be exactly what she had been searching for without knowing it, a chance not just for survival or security, but for true partnership and possibility. With that thought, Eleanor finally drifted off to sleep, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling into the night around her. Eleanor woke to the sound of voices drifting up through the floorboards. The room was still dark, though a gray light was beginning to seep through the curtains. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, before memory came flooding back. Montana, the ranch, James, the wedding that was supposed to happen today. She rose and dressed quickly in the chill morning air, choosing a simple day dress and pinning her hair carefully. When she descended the stairs, she found Mrs. Chen in the kitchen, pulling fresh biscuits from the oven. The older woman turned and smiled. "Good morning, Miss Walsh. You are an early riser. This is good. Ranch life begins early." Mrs. Chen poured coffee into a sturdy mug and set it before Eleanor. "Mr. James is in the barn with the men. He said to tell you he will be back for breakfast in half an hour." Eleanor sipped the strong, hot coffee and watched through the kitchen window as the sky slowly brightened. She could see the vast expanse of the ranch more clearly now in the growing light. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks touched with gold from the rising sun. Cattle moved slowly across the grassland, dark shapes against the pale grass. It was beautiful in a way that was entirely different from Boston's narrow streets and brick buildings. "Have you worked here long?" Eleanor asked Mrs. Chen. 3 years, since Mr. James built this house." Mrs. Chen began cracking eggs into a bowl. "He is a good man, Miss Walsh, fair and honest. After my husband died, many people would not hire Chinese women. Mr. James, he did not care about that. He cared only if I could cook and keep house well." She paused in her work and looked directly at Eleanor. His first wife, she was not a good woman. She looked down on everyone, treated me like I was nothing. I was happy when she left, though it hurt Mr. James very much. Eleanor absorbed this information, grateful for Mrs. Chen's frank assessment. "Did he love her very much?" "I think he loved the idea of her," Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully. "The idea of having a wife and family, of building something lasting. But no, I do not think he loved her truly. He was lonely, and she was beautiful and said right words. But words mean nothing without truth behind them." The back door opened, and James entered, bringing with him the smell of hay and horses and the sharp morning air. He looked surprised to see Eleanor already up. "You're an early riser. That's good. Though I expected you might sleep late after your journey." "Years of teaching school trained me to wake at dawn," Eleanor said. "Once that habit is formed, it's hard to break." They ate breakfast together, the conversation easier than it had been the night before. James told her about his morning routine, about the calves that had been born in the past week, about repairs needed on the north fence line. Eleanor found herself genuinely interested, asking questions about the ranch operations and listening carefully to his answers. After breakfast, James brought the wagon around front again. "Are you ready to go into town? We can speak with Reverend Matthews and make arrangements for this afternoon if you're still willing. Or we can simply visit the general store and let you see more of Silver Creek. No pressure either way." Eleanor took a deep breath and met his eyes. "I'm ready to speak with the Reverend." The ride into town was pleasant in the crisp morning air. James pointed out landmarks along the way, telling her stories about the early days of the settlement. But as they neared town, Eleanor noticed his shoulders tensing and a worried look crossing his face. "What's wrong?" she asked. James hesitated. "There's something else I haven't told you. Something about Silver Creek that you need to know before we're married. I should have mentioned it yesterday, but I was already worried about your reaction to the ranch, and I didn't want to overwhelm you with too much at once." Eleanor's stomach tightened. What else could there be? "Tell me now." "There's another rancher in the area, a man named Clayton Merrick. He owns the property to the north of mine, nearly as much land as I have. He's been trying to buy me out for the past 2 years, and when I refused, things got difficult. There have been incidents, cattle gone missing, fences cut, a barn fire that we managed to put out before it spread. Nothing I can prove was his doing, but everyone in town knows there's bad blood between us." "Why does he want your land so badly?" James's jaw tightened. "Because my property has the best water rights in the valley. The creek that runs through my land feeds into the river that runs through his. If he controlled my water access, he'd effectively control most of the ranching in this area. He could name his price to other smaller ranchers who need water for their cattle." Eleanor processed this information. "So by marrying you, I'm stepping into the middle of a range war?" "I wouldn't call it a war," James said quickly. "More like a cold conflict. But yes, Merrick won't be happy when he hears I'm married. He tried to court my first wife after she left me, thinking she might influence me to sell. She was briefly interested until she learned he was in debt up to his eyeballs despite all his big talk. He's been angry about that rejection ever since." They had reached the outskirts of town now. Eleanor could see people on the street going about their morning business. She thought about getting back in the wagon and asking James to take her to the train station. She thought about the safe, predictable life she had left behind in Boston. Then she thought about Mrs. Chen's words, about how James was a good and honest man, and about how he had shared this difficult information even though it might drive her away. "I appreciate you telling me," Eleanor said finally, "though you're right that you might have picked a better time. Anything else I should know before we speak with the Reverend? Any other enemies or secrets or complications?" James actually laughed, a sound of relief. "No, I think that covers it. I've been completely honest now, I swear it. The ranch is prosperous but requires hard work. I had a disastrous first marriage, and I'm in a property dispute with a difficult neighbor. That's the full truth of the situation you're marrying into." "Then let's go talk to Reverend Matthews." The church was a simple white building at the end of the main street. Reverend Matthews was a round, cheerful man in his 50s who greeted them warmly. He listened as James explained the situation, occasionally glancing at Eleanor with kind, assessing eyes. "So you've only just met," the Reverend said, "and you want to marry today?" "We've been corresponding for 6 weeks," Eleanor said. "And yes, I know it seems hasty, but I didn't come all this way to delay. If Mr. Thornton is agreeable, I'd like to proceed as planned." Reverend Matthews nodded slowly. "I've known James for 3 years now. He's a good man, though he's had his share of troubles. Miss Walsh, I feel obliged to ask if you're entering into this marriage of your own free will, without coercion or pressure." "I am," Eleanor said firmly. "I came west seeking a new life and a true partnership. I believe Mr. Thornton can offer both." "Then I'll be happy to perform the ceremony," the Reverend said. "Shall we say 4 o'clock this afternoon? That will give you time to find witnesses and make any preparations you need." As they left the church, Eleanor felt both exhilarated and terrified. In a few hours, she would be married to a man she had known for less than 24 hours. It was madness. It was exactly what she had signed up for when she responded to that advertisement. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet fully imagine. James took her to the general store, where she met Mrs. Patterson, the shopkeeper's wife, a friendly woman who immediately offered to stand as witness at the wedding. They purchased a few necessities, including fabric that Eleanor thought might make good curtains for the guest bedroom. As they moved through the store, Eleanor noticed how people reacted to James. Some greeted him warmly, others nodded with respect, and a few seemed to keep their distance. On the way back to the ranch, they passed a large gate marking the entrance to another property. The sign read, Merrick Ranch, in bold letters. Eleanor saw James's hands tighten on the reins. "That's his land?" she asked. "Yes. His house is about 2 miles in from the road. We try to avoid crossing paths when possible." As if summoned by the conversation, a group of riders appeared on the road ahead. There were 4 of them, and the man in the lead rode with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to getting his way. He was perhaps 40 years old, with a thick mustache and cold gray eyes. When he saw James's wagon, he held up his hand to halt his companions. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "James Thornton out for a morning ride. And who's this? Don't tell me you've found yourself another mail-order bride." James's voice was carefully neutral. "Good morning, Merrick. This is Miss Eleanor Walsh. Eleanor, this is Clayton Merrick, my neighbor to the north." Merrick touched his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Walsh. I hope Thornton here has been honest with you about his circumstances. Has he mentioned that his first wife left him high and dry, or that his ranch is mortgaged to the hilt?" "My ranch is free and clear, and you know it," James said, his voice hardening. "And my personal business is none of your concern." "Everything in this valley is my concern," Merrick said, "especially when it affects water rights and property values. You should think carefully before you tie yourself to this man, Miss Walsh. Life out here can be hard, and it's harder still when you're on the wrong side of certain disagreements." Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest. She didn't like being talked about as if she weren't there, and she particularly didn't like the veiled threat in Merrick's words. Before James could respond, she spoke up. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Merrick, but I'm quite capable of making my own decisions, and from what I've seen so far, Mr. Thornton's circumstances seem very solid indeed." Merrick's eyes narrowed. "Spirit, that's good. You'll need it." He touched his hat again, this time with less mockery. "Welcome to Montana territory, Miss Walsh. I have a feeling we'll be seeing more of each other." With that, he spurred his horse and rode past them, his men following close behind. James remained silent until they were well past Merrick's group. Then he let out a long breath. "I'm sorry about that. He has a talent for making encounters unpleasant." "He doesn't frighten me," Eleanor said, though her heart was still racing. "Though I can see why you're concerned about him. He's not just unpleasant. He's dangerous. He's been involved in some shady dealings, and there are rumors he's connected to cattle rustlers who operate in the territory. But he's also smart enough to cover his tracks, so there's never enough evidence to bring charges." They rode the rest of the way to the ranch in contemplative silence. Eleanor found herself thinking about everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. She had come west expecting poverty and hardship with an honest man. Instead, she had found wealth and comfort with an honest man who also came with complications and conflicts. Was it better or worse than what she had imagined? She honestly didn't know. Back at the ranch, Mrs. Chen had lunch ready. Over roast beef sandwiches, James outlined his plans for the afternoon. He would ride out to check on the north fence line and would return by 3:30 to clean up before the wedding. Eleanor would have time to rest and prepare. Mrs. Chen would accompany them to town to serve as the second witness. After lunch, Eleanor went upstairs to her room. She laid out her best dress, the green wool she had worn to dinner the night before. It wasn't a traditional white wedding gown, but it was the best she had. She thought about the wedding she had once imagined for herself back in Boston, with a church full of family and friends, with her mother there to see her married. This would be so different, just a simple ceremony with strangers as witnesses. But perhaps simple was better. Perhaps all the pomp and ceremony of a traditional wedding would have been false anyway, given that she barely knew the man she was marrying. This way felt more honest, a practical beginning to what she hoped would be a practical partnership. At 3 o'clock, Eleanor began to dress. She unpinned her hair and brushed it until it shone, then pinned it back up in her most elaborate style. She put on her best petticoats and the green dress, fastening each button with trembling fingers. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman about to step off a cliff into the unknown. But she also saw strength in her own eyes, a determination that had carried her across the country and would carry her through whatever came next. A knock at the door made her turn. "Yes? Miss Walsh?" It was Mrs. Chen. "Mr. James is ready, and I have something for you, if you will accept it." Eleanor opened the door to find Mrs. Chen holding a bouquet of dried flowers, carefully arranged and tied with a white ribbon. "I dried these from my garden in the summer," Mrs. Chen said, "for special occasions. I would be honored if you would carry them today." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. It was such a small gesture, but it meant so much. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. They're beautiful." Mrs. Chen smiled. "You are a good woman, I think. You will be good for Mr. James, and he will be good for you. Now come. It is time to go." Eleanor descended the stairs with the dried flowers clutched in her hands. James was waiting in the entry hall, and when he looked up and saw her, his expression made her breath catch. He looked at her as if she were something precious and unexpected, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." James had changed into his best suit, a dark wool that fit him well and made his blue eyes even more striking. He offered her his arm, and together they walked out to the wagon where Mrs. Chen was already waiting. The ride into town seemed both too long and too short. Eleanor's mind was racing with last-minute doubts and second thoughts. What was she doing? She barely knew this man. Yes, he seemed kind and honest, but what if she was wrong? What if there were other secrets he hadn't revealed? What if she was making the biggest mistake of her life? But then she thought about what she would be returning to if she backed out now. Her sister's spare bedroom and the constant reminders that she was a burden, the closed school and the lack of prospects. The narrow, circumscribed life of a spinster in a city that had no use for unmarried women of her age. Was that really better than taking a chance on something new? They arrived at the church to find Reverend Matthews and Mrs. Patterson waiting. The sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains, casting everything in golden light. James helped Eleanor down from the wagon, and they walked together into the small church. The ceremony was simple and surprisingly moving. Reverend Matthews spoke about the covenant of marriage, about partnership and commitment, about building a life together through joy and hardship. When it came time for the vows, Eleanor's voice was steady as she promised to love, honor, and cherish James Thornton. James's voice shook slightly as he made the same promises to her. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them man and wife, James kissed Eleanor gently, a brief, chaste kiss that nonetheless sent warmth flooding through her. They signed the marriage certificate with Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen as witnesses, and just like that, Eleanor Walsh became Eleanor Thornton. As they emerged from the church into the fading sunlight, Eleanor felt as if she were walking in a dream. She was married. She was Mrs. James Thornton, mistress of one of the most prosperous ranches in Montana Territory. It was real and surreal all at once. On the ride back to the ranch, James reached over and took her hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for taking a chance on me, despite all the complications. I promise I'll do everything I can to make you happy." Eleanor squeezed his hand in return. "And I promise to be a true partner to you, in whatever ways I can." But even as she made that promise, Eleanor couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The encounter with Merrick that morning had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. And as they rode through the gathering dusk, She could have sworn she saw riders watching them from a distant hillside. When she blinked and looked again, they were gone. Perhaps it was just her imagination, stirred up by all the stress and excitement of the day. Or perhaps it was a sign that the challenges she and James would face were only just beginning. The first week of Eleanor's marriage passed in a blur of new experiences and small adjustments. She had her own bedroom, a fact that both relieved and disappointed her. James had been clear on their wedding night that he would not rush her into the physical aspects of marriage, that they should take time to know each other first. It was gentlemanly and considerate, but it also left Eleanor feeling suspended between two states, neither fully married nor fully independent. She spent her days exploring the ranch and learning its rhythms. Mrs. Chen was patient in showing her where everything was kept and how the household ran. Eleanor discovered that she had a talent for keeping accounts, and James gratefully turned over the ranch's financial records for her to organize. The books revealed that James had been truthful about the ranch's prosperity. The income was substantial, the debts minimal, and the future looked secure if they could maintain their current operations. But Eleanor also sensed tension among the ranch hands. Tom, the foreman, was a weathered man in his 50s who had worked for James since the beginning. He was friendly enough, but clearly reserved judgment on the new Mrs. Thornton. The other men, Billy, Frank, Sam, and a quiet youth named David, followed Tom's lead. One morning, Eleanor was working on the account books in James's office when she heard raised voices outside. She went to the window and saw Tom and James in heated discussion near the barn. After a moment, Tom threw up his hands and stalked away. James stood alone, his shoulders tense, before he too disappeared into the barn. Eleanor found Tom later that afternoon, mending tack in the barn. "Tom, may I ask you something?" The foreman looked up warily. "Yes, Mom? Is there something wrong? I couldn't help but notice you and James seemed to be arguing this morning." Tom was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. "I probably shouldn't speak of it, ma'am. Ranch business." "I'm part of this ranch now," Eleanor said gently. "If there's a problem, I'd like to know about it." Tom set down the leather strap he'd been working on. "It's Merrick's men. They've been seen on our land 3 times in the past week, always near the north fence line. Yesterday we found 10 head of cattle missing from the north pasture. Could be coincidence, could be rustlers, but I'd bet my last dollar it's Merrick trying to send a message." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What kind of message?" "That he's not done trying to pressure Mr. James into selling. He's been quiet for a few months, and I think we all hoped he'd given up. But your arrival seems to have stirred things up again." Tom looked at her directly. "Merrick doesn't like it when people stand up to him, and he especially doesn't like it when they seem to be thriving despite his interference." That evening, Eleanor confronted James about what Tom had told her. They were in the parlor after dinner, James reading over correspondence, while Eleanor worked on mending one of his shirts. She set down her needle and thread. "James, I spoke with Tom today. He told me about the missing cattle and Merrick's men on our land. Why didn't you tell me?" James looked up, guilt flickering across his face. "I didn't want to worry you. You're still adjusting to life here, and I thought I could handle it without involving you." "But I am involved," Eleanor said, keeping her voice calm despite her frustration. "This is my home now, too. I can't help with problems I don't know about." James closed his ledger and gave her his full attention. "You're right. I'm sorry. Old habits, I suppose. I'm used to dealing with everything on my own." He rubbed his face tiredly. "Tom thinks we should post guards at night, at least around the north pasture. I've been resisting because it feels like admitting we're under siege. But I'm starting to think he's right. What does Merrick actually want? You said he wants to buy your land, but surely he understands you're not going to sell." "Men like Merrick don't think like normal people. In his mind, everything and everyone has a price. He can't comprehend that I might value this ranch for reasons beyond money. And he's not a patient man. The longer I refuse him, the angrier he gets." Eleanor thought for a moment. "Has anyone actually confronted him directly about the missing cattle? Asked him point blank if he's involved?" "We have no proof," James said, And accusing a man like Merrick without proof is dangerous. He's well connected, knows the territorial governor, has friends in high places. If we make accusations we can't back up, it could backfire badly. Eleanor stood and began pacing, her mind working through the problem. What if we don't accuse him directly, but make it clear we know what's happening? What if we ride over to his ranch tomorrow, the two of us together, and simply inform him that we're posting guards and will prosecute anyone caught trespassing to the fullest extent of the law? Not an accusation, just a statement of our intentions. James looked at her with surprise and something that might have been admiration. That's actually not a bad idea. It would show strength without making direct accusations. But Eleanor, I'm not sure I want you anywhere near Merrick. He's unpredictable. I'm your wife, Eleanor said firmly. Merrick needs to see that we're a united front. That intimidating you means intimidating both of us. If I hide away every time there's trouble, what does that say about our partnership? James stood and crossed to where she stood by the window. He took her hands in his. You're tougher than I gave you credit for, Eleanor Thornton. All right, we'll ride over together tomorrow morning. But we take Tom with us, and we don't go inside his house. We state our piece, and we leave. Agreed? Agreed. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. She heard James moving around in his room next door, heard him pace for a while before finally settling down. She wondered if he was as nervous about tomorrow as she was. Morning came bright and cold. Eleanor dressed carefully in her most practical riding outfit, a split skirt and sturdy jacket that Mrs. Chen had helped her acquire from the general store. James was already in the kitchen when she came down, speaking in low tones with Tom. They rode out just after breakfast, the three of them mounted on strong horses. Eleanor had been practicing her riding every day, and while she wasn't as skilled as the men, she could hold her own. The ride to Merrick's ranch took 40 minutes, following a trail that ran along the boundary between the two properties. Merrick's ranch house was larger than James's, a sprawling structure that spoke of money spent more for show than for comfort. They found Merrick on the front porch, drinking coffee and smoking a cigar. He showed no surprise at their arrival. The newlyweds come calling, Merrick said, not bothering to stand. To what do I owe this pleasure? James remained mounted, keeping his horse at a comfortable distance from the porch. We're here to inform you that we're posting guards on our property, particularly along the north boundary. Anyone caught trespassing will be prosecuted. Anyone caught stealing cattle will be arrested and tried. Merrick blew a smoke ring. Interesting. Are you accusing me of something, Thornton? I'm stating our intentions, James said evenly. Nothing more. We've had some problems recently, and we're taking steps to address them. Merrick's gaze shifted to Eleanor. And you, Mrs. Thornton, do you support your husband's aggressive stance toward his neighbors? Eleanor met his eyes steadily. I support protecting what's ours. That seems reasonable to me. Does it? Merrick leaned forward, his expression hardening. Let me tell you what I think is reasonable. A man who controls water rights in this valley has a responsibility to the entire community. Hoarding those rights for personal gain while other ranchers struggle, that's not reasonable. That's selfish. My water rights are my own, James said. And they're not for sale at any price. Accept that and move on, Merrick. Merrick stood slowly, his hand resting on his belt near where Eleanor could see a revolver holstered. You're making a mistake, Thornton. You and your new bride. This valley isn't big enough for both of us to prosper. Eventually, one of us will have to give way. I'm betting it won't be me. Tom's hand moved toward his own weapon, but James shook his head slightly. We've said what we came to say. Good day, Merrick. They turned their horses and rode away at a measured pace, refusing to show fear by hurrying. Eleanor felt eyes on her back the entire ride down the long drive from Merrick's house. Only when they were well away from the property did she allow herself to breathe normally again. Well, Tom said, that went about as well as could be expected. He knows we're onto him, and he knows we're not backing down. But he's not going to stop, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. No, ma'am, Tom agreed. Men like Merrick never do. They just get sneakier and meaner. The next few days proved Tom right. The harassment became more subtle, but more frequent. A water trough was fouled with dead animals. Fence posts were loosened in the night. The gate to the south pasture was left open, allowing cattle to wander. Nothing major, but enough to keep them constantly on edge. Eleanor found herself unable to sleep properly, startling awake at every sound. One night, she finally gave up on sleep and went downstairs to make tea. She found James already in the kitchen, staring out the window into the darkness. "Can't sleep either?" Eleanor asked. James turned, looking weary. "I keep thinking I should send you back east, back to safety. This isn't what you signed up for." Eleanor poured hot water over tea leaves and brought 2 cups to the table. She sat across from James and looked at him directly. "I signed up for a partnership. That means being here for the hard times as well as the good. If you send me away, you're telling me I'm not really your partner, just a decoration to be protected and sheltered." "It's not about that," James protested. "It's about keeping you safe." "And what about keeping you safe? Do I not worry about that?" Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. "James, we're in this together. That's what marriage means. We face the problems together. We find solutions together. Sending me away doesn't solve anything. It just means you're alone again, and I refuse to let that happen." James turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. "How did I get so lucky? After the disaster with my first wife, I thought I'd never trust my judgment again. But you're nothing like her. You're strong and smart and brave." "I'm terrified," Eleanor admitted. "But being terrified doesn't mean running away. It means figuring out how to move forward despite the fear." They sat in companionable silence, drinking their tea and holding hands across the table. It was a small moment, insignificant in many ways, but Eleanor felt something shift between them. They were truly becoming partners, bound together not just by legal ceremony, but by shared challenges and mutual respect. The next morning brought fresh trouble. Tom came to the house before breakfast, his face grim. "Mr. James, Mrs. Eleanor, you need to see this." They followed him to the north pasture, where they found a section of fence not just broken, but deliberately destroyed. Posts had been pulled up, wire cut and tangled, and in the dirt someone had trampled a clear message: "Sell or suffer." Eleanor felt rage wash through her, hot and cleansing. She had been afraid, yes, but now she was angry. This was her home, her land, her life. Merrick had no right to threaten them this way. "That's it," she said, her voice sharp. "We're not just defending anymore. It's time to go on the offensive." James and Tom both looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" James asked. Eleanor's mind was racing, fitting pieces together. "Merrick thinks he can intimidate us because we're isolated. But what if we weren't? What if we made alliances with the other ranchers in the valley? You said yourself that Merrick controls water access for some of them. What if we offered to share our water rights with smaller ranchers in exchange for a mutual protection agreement?" Tom's eyes widened. "That could work. There are 3 or 4 smaller operations that have been struggling. If they knew they could rely on our water and our support, they'd probably stand with us against Merrick." James was nodding slowly. "It would shift the balance of power in the valley. Instead of it being Merrick versus me, it would be Merrick versus a coalition. He'd have a much harder time using intimidation tactics if he knew he was making enemies of half the valley." "Exactly," Eleanor said. "And we make it very public. We announce it in town, maybe even get a reporter from the territorial newspaper to write about it. Make it clear that we're not isolated targets, but part of a community standing together." For the first time in days, James smiled broadly. "Eleanor Thornton, you're brilliant. Absolutely brilliant." He grabbed her and spun her around, both of them laughing despite the seriousness of the situation. Over the next week, They put Eleanor's plan into action. They rode out to visit every small ranch in the valley, explaining their proposal. Most of the ranchers were initially wary, having learned to keep their heads down around Merrick. But when they realized that James was offering genuine help with no strings attached, and that standing together gave them all better protection, one by one they agreed. Eleanor found herself energized by the work. She talked to the ranchers' wives, building relationships and trust. She helped draft the formal agreements, using her education to ensure everything was legally sound. She worked with Mrs. Patterson at the general store to spread word of the new alliance throughout town. By the end of the second week, they had 6 ranches committed to the mutual protection and water sharing agreement. They held a meeting at James and Eleanor's ranch, where all the ranchers and their families gathered. It was the first time Eleanor had hosted such an event, and she was nervous, but Mrs. Chen helped her prepare food and organize everything perfectly. Standing in her parlor, surrounded by their new allies, Eleanor felt a surge of pride and belonging. These people were now her community, her neighbors, her friends. This was no longer just James's ranch, it was their ranch, and they were building something larger than either of them could have created alone. The alliance became official news when a reporter from Helena arrived to write a story about the unprecedented cooperation among ranchers in Silver Creek Valley. The article praised the innovation and community spirit, holding it up as an example of how the West was evolving beyond simple frontier individualism. The day the article was published, James brought a copy home from town. They read it together, and Eleanor saw tears in his eyes as he reached the part where the reporter quoted him saying, "My wife showed me that strength comes from standing together, not standing alone. She's transformed not just my ranch, but the entire valley." "I didn't do it alone," Eleanor protested. "No," James agreed, pulling her close. "We did it together. Just like we'll face whatever comes next, together." That night, when Eleanor retired to her room, she found a note slipped under her door. It was from James, his elegant handwriting filling a single page. "Eleanor, these past few weeks have shown me what true partnership means. You came here as a stranger, and you've become the most important person in my life. Would you consider moving into my room if you're ready? I want to be your husband in every sense of the word, but only when you're ready. All my love, James." Eleanor read the note 3 times, her heart racing. She thought about the man she had married, about how he had proven himself over and over to be kind, honest, strong, and worthy of her trust. She thought about how they had faced every challenge as a team, how he had listened to her ideas and valued her contributions. She thought about how, when she looked at him now, she felt not just respect and admiration, but genuine affection. She picked up her pen and wrote a single word on the bottom of his note. "Yes." Then she walked down the hallway and knocked softly on James's door. When he opened it, she handed him the note. He read her answer, and his face transformed with joy. He took her hand and drew her inside, closing the door gently behind them. And for the first time since their marriage began, Eleanor truly felt like she had come home. The winter came to Montana with breathtaking suddenness. One morning, Eleanor woke to find the world transformed, blanketed in snow that sparkled like diamonds under a brilliant blue sky. From her bedroom window, which was now their bedroom window, she watched James and the ranch hands working to bring the cattle closer to the barn, where they would be easier to feed and protect through the harsh months ahead.
3 months had passed since the formation of the Ranchers' Alliance, and the results had exceeded everyone's expectations. Merrick had gone unnaturally quiet, withdrawing to his own property and ceasing his campaign of harassment. The smaller ranchers were thriving with reliable water access, and several had already expanded their herds. The community that had formed around the alliance had grown into genuine friendships and mutual support.
But Eleanor knew better than to assume Merrick had given up. Men like him didn't surrender. They regrouped and planned. She had been keeping careful watch on his activities through conversations with people in town and by maintaining the detailed records she had started when she first arrived. She documented every interaction, every incident, building a case that might someday be needed. In the meantime, life on the ranch had settled into a rhythm, that Eleanor found deeply satisfying. She had taken over all the bookkeeping and correspondence, freeing James to focus on the actual ranching work he loved. She had also started teaching reading and arithmetic to the ranch hands 2 evenings a week, something they had initially been shy about, but now attended faithfully. Young David, in particular, had proven to be a gifted student, devouring every book Eleanor could provide. Her relationship with James had deepened into something rich and complex. They were partners in every sense, sharing the work of running the ranch, making decisions together, supporting each other through challenges. But they had also become friends and lovers, finding joy in quiet evenings by the fire and in the 1,000 small intimacies of daily life together. Eleanor had never imagined that marriage could be like this, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and growing love. One evening in early December, as they sat together reviewing the ranch accounts, James suddenly set down his pen and looked at her seriously. "Eleanor, there's something I want to discuss with you. Something important." Eleanor felt a flutter of concern. "What is it?" "The ranch is doing better than ever. The alliance has created stability and growth for everyone involved. And I've been thinking about the future, about what we want to build here." James took her hand. "How would you feel about expanding our operations? Not just more cattle, but diversification, maybe sheep as well, or even horses. The market for good working horses is strong, and I think we have the resources to do it right." Eleanor considered the proposal. It would mean more work, more employees, more complexity to manage. But it would also mean less vulnerability if anything happened to the cattle market. "I think it's smart, actually. But we should consult with the other ranchers in the alliance first, make sure we're not creating competition that could harm them." James smiled. "See, this is why I married you. You think 3 steps ahead while I'm still on step 1. "That's not true," Eleanor protested. "You're the one who understands ranching and the land. I just help with the practical details. You do far more than that, and you know it." James pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "You transformed this place, Eleanor. Not just the ranch, but the whole valley. You saw possibilities I never imagined." Before Eleanor could respond, they heard the sound of a horse arriving at a gallop. James was on his feet immediately, reaching for the rifle he kept near the door. It was full dark outside, and no one rode that hard at night unless there was trouble. Tom burst through the door, his face flushed from cold and exertion. "Mr. James, Mrs. Eleanor, it's Merrick. His barn is on fire. The whole thing's going up and the fire's spreading toward his house. He's asking for help." James didn't hesitate. "Get every man saddled up. Bring every bucket and blanket we have. Eleanor, wake Mrs. Chen and have her prepare the guest rooms. If Merrick's family needs shelter, we'll provide it." Within minutes, the ranch exploded into action. James and the hands rode hard toward Merrick's property, their horses loaded with firefighting equipment. Eleanor and Mrs. Chen prepared the house, heating water, laying out blankets, getting medical supplies ready in case anyone was injured. Eleanor paced anxiously, watching out the window for any sign of their return. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, she saw torches approaching and heard the sound of multiple horses. James and the men returned, covered in soot and ash, exhausted but unharmed. Behind them came another group, Merrick and 3 of his ranch hands, equally exhausted and filthy. To Eleanor's surprise, Merrick's wife and 2 young daughters were with them, wrapped in blankets and clearly shaken. Eleanor immediately went into action, guiding Mrs. Merrick and the girls inside, offering them hot tea and a place to warm themselves. Mrs. Merrick was a thin, tired-looking woman who seemed overwhelmed by everything. Her daughters, probably about 8 and 10 years old, clung to their mother and stared around with wide eyes. "The house?" Eleanor asked James quietly. "We saved it barely. The barn is a total loss, along with half his stored hay and some equipment. If we hadn't gotten there when we did, he would have lost everything." James looked at Merrick, who stood awkwardly in the entryway. "You're welcome to stay here tonight, all of you. We have room." Merrick's face worked with conflicting emotions. Pride warred with gratitude, anger with relief. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. "Why? After everything I've done, why would you help me?" Eleanor answered before James could. "Because that's what neighbors do, and because your family shouldn't suffer for our disagreements." Mrs. Merrick began to cry quietly. Thank you so much." They settled the Merrick family in the guest rooms. Mrs. Chen prepared a late supper, and Eleanor made sure everyone was comfortable. The two girls, Sarah and Lucy, were shy at first but gradually relaxed, as Eleanor talked gently with them about their dolls and their pony that had been safely moved away from the fire. The men gathered in the kitchen where James and Merrick finally had the conversation that had been years in coming. Eleanor stayed with the Merrick women in the parlor, but could hear snatches of the discussion through the half-open door. "I was wrong." That was Merrick's voice, rough with emotion. "About everything, about trying to force you out, about the harassment, about thinking I could control the whole valley. Tonight, watching my barn burn, knowing I could lose everything, and then seeing you ride up with help even after what I'd done. I was wrong." "Why?" James asked. "Why did you hate me so much? Was it really just about the water rights?" There was a long silence. Then Merrick spoke again, his voice quieter. "It was never really about the water. It was about pride. You came here with nothing and built something impressive. I came here with family money and connections, and I've barely held even. Every time I looked at your success, it reminded me of my own failures, and I hated you for it." Eleanor heard the sound of a chair scraping back. "I'm not going to pretend we can be friends," James said. "Too much has happened for that. But we can be neighbors who respect boundaries and property lines. We can be men who help each other in emergencies. That's enough." "It's more than enough," Merrick agreed. "And Thornton? Tell your wife I said she's too good for the likes of either of us." Despite the tension of the situation, Eleanor found herself smiling. She returned her attention to Mrs. Merrick, who was watching her daughters drowse by the fire. "I owe you an apology too," Mrs. Merrick said softly. "I knew some of what Clayton was doing. Not all of it, but enough. I should have spoken up, but I was afraid. Afraid of his temper, afraid of upsetting things, afraid of being left alone out here with no way to support the girls." Eleanor sat beside her. "You're not alone. Whatever happens next, you have neighbors now who will help if you need it." Mrs. Merrick wiped her eyes. "How do you do it? Stand up to men like my husband and make them listen? I've always been so afraid." "I was afraid too," Eleanor admitted. "I still am sometimes. But I learned that being afraid and being strong aren't opposite things. You can be both at once. And sometimes you find strength you didn't know you had when it matters most." The Merrick family stayed for 3 days while their house was cleaned of smoke damage and temporary repairs were made. During that time, a strange kind of friendship developed between Eleanor and Mrs. Merrick, whose first name she learned was Catherine. Catherine had come from Philadelphia, another mail-order bride drawn west by promises that hadn't quite matched reality. She was educated and thoughtful, but years of living with a difficult, prideful man had worn her down. Eleanor shared books with Catherine and spent time teaching Sarah and Lucy alongside David in the evening lessons. She saw how much the girls craved attention and intellectual stimulation, and she began to imagine possibilities for the future of the valley beyond just ranching alliances. On the third evening, as they prepared for the Merricks to return home the next day, Catherine took Eleanor aside. "I want to ask you something. When you write to your friends back east, would you mention that we have a small settlement here that could use a proper school teacher? Someone educated and brave enough to come west? I have some money saved, and I think the other families in the valley would contribute too. The children deserve better than what we can give them." Eleanor's heart leaped at the idea. "Catherine, that's brilliant. I'll write letters tonight. And in the meantime, what if we started a small school ourselves? Nothing formal, just gathering the children from the various ranches once or twice a week? I could teach them, and you could help. We could use our barn or this parlor." Catherine's face lit up for the first time since Eleanor had met her. "Could we really? Clayton would never allow me to teach in town, But if it's just neighbors helping neighbors, then it's settled, Eleanor said firmly. We'll start after the new year. When the Merricks finally departed, Clayton shook James's hand with genuine respect. I'm rebuilding the barn starting tomorrow, and I want you to know, the harassment stops. All of it. You have my word. And the water rights? James asked. Are yours, as they should be. I was a fool to ever think otherwise. Merrick looked at Eleanor. Your husband is a lucky man, Mrs. Thornton. You're quite a force of nature. After they left, Eleanor and James stood on the porch, watching the wagon disappear down the road. James wrapped his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. A force of nature. I can't argue with that assessment. He's trying, Eleanor said. That's all we can ask for. You really believe he's changed? Eleanor thought about it carefully. I believe he's had a wake-up call. Whether he sustains the change, time will tell. But I think Catherine will hold him accountable. She's stronger than she looks. December turned to January, and the school plan came to fruition. Every Saturday, children from 6 families in the Alliance gathered at the Thornton Ranch for lessons. Eleanor taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, while Catherine taught geography and history. Mrs. Chen contributed by teaching the children about Chinese culture and language, something they found fascinating. Even James got involved, teaching the older children about animal husbandry and land management. The informal school became a social center for the whole valley. Families stayed after lessons to share meals and news. Friendships deepened. The community that had begun as a practical alliance for mutual protection evolved into something richer and more meaningful. In February, as winter began to loosen its grip, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening as they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. James's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He pulled her close, his face a mixture of joy and wonder. A baby. We're going to have a baby. Then concern crossed his features. Are you happy about this? I know we haven't really discussed children much. I'm happy, Eleanor said, and she meant it. Terrified but happy. This feels right, James. Building a family here, creating something lasting. Our child will grow up with all of this, James said, gesturing to the ranch spread out before them. The land, the community, the school. They'll grow up knowing they're part of something larger than themselves. Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had left Boston as a desperate woman with few options, responding to an advertisement from a man she'd never met. She had expected poverty and hardship. Instead, she had found wealth she hadn't anticipated, challenges she hadn't imagined, and love she hadn't dared to hope for. Do you ever regret it? James asked, as if reading her thoughts. Coming here? Marrying a man you barely knew? Never, Eleanor said without hesitation. This is where I was meant to be. You are who I was meant to find. I believe that now. Spring arrived with dramatic suddenness, the snow melting to reveal the greening grassland beneath. The cattle were moved to summer pasture, calves were born, and the ranch burst into activity. Eleanor, now visibly pregnant, continued to manage the books and correspondence while Catherine took over more of the teaching duties. In April, they received word that a certified schoolteacher had been recruited from Ohio and would arrive in June to establish a proper school in Silver Creek. The news was celebrated throughout the valley, with families pledging money and labor to build a schoolhouse. Eleanor and Catherine were instrumental in planning the school, deciding on curriculum, and arranging for books and supplies to be shipped from the east. Eleanor found herself thinking often about her own teaching career in Boston, about how cramped and limited that world had seemed. Here, she was helping to build something from the ground up, shaping the education of an entire generation of Montana children. In May, James surprised her by presenting plans for an expansion to the ranch house. We're going to need a nursery, he said, and probably more bedrooms after that. I'm thinking at least 3 more children, if you're agreeable. Eleanor laughed. Let's see how the first one goes before we plan for 4. But yes, I think expanding the house is wise. And I've been thinking we should add a proper library too, somewhere to keep all the books we've been collecting. The construction began in June, with most of the work being done by ranch hands during their off hours. Other families from the Alliance contributed labor, turning it into a community project. The barn raising became a social event, with everyone gathering to help and celebrate. One evening, as Eleanor watched the sun set over the construction site, she felt a flutter in her belly. The baby, moving for the first time in a way she could truly feel. She placed her hand over the spot and smiled. Mrs. Chen came to stand beside her. "You are happy here," the older woman said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Eleanor agreed. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be. This is good. You have built something strong. Not just the house, not just the ranch, the community, the friendships, the trust. These things last longer than buildings." Eleanor thought about that as she prepared for bed that night. She had come to Montana thinking she would help a struggling farmer survive. Instead, she had become part of creating a thriving community, a place where children learned and families supported each other, where former enemies could become allies, and where a mail-order bride could find her true purpose. James came to bed late, smelling of sawdust and honest labor. He pulled Eleanor close, his hand resting gently on her swollen belly. "I love you," he said simply. "I don't say it enough, but I do. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." "I love you too," Eleanor said, and marveled at how true it was. She had married a stranger out of necessity and desperation. But through shared challenges and mutual respect, through working together toward common goals, that stranger had become her partner, her friend, her love. The baby kicked against James's palm, and they both laughed. Their future was uncertain in many ways. There would be more challenges, more conflicts to navigate, more hard work ahead. But they would face it all together, as they had faced everything since the day Eleanor stepped off that train in Silver Creek. She had thought she was marrying a poor farmer and would spend her life struggling to survive. Instead, she had married a wealthy rancher and spent her life building something far more valuable than material prosperity. She had found home, community, purpose, and love. And as she drifted off to sleep in James's arms, Eleanor smiled, knowing that the best parts of their story were still ahead of them. The adventures they would share, the children they would raise, the community they would continue to nurture. She had taken a chance on a life unknown, and it had given her everything she never knew she needed. The mail-order bride from Boston had become Montana's Mrs. Thornton, and she had never been happier.